And once again, good evening, everyone. Welcome to We Are the Builders Australia, live study tonight. And once again, we're still continuing on with our study, Peru Libre. And I'd like to welcome once again Helen and Nate. Helen, how are you tonight?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
And Nate, how's things up there in Sydney? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, Nate.
Sorry, there, guys. Yeah, no, it's good. It's you know how it is. It's still going. But we're going through the problems anyway, so we'll discuss it.
Fair enough. Well, first, before we continue on, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm actually broadcasting here from the land of the Jar Jar Ryan, and obviously people listening in are around the various parts of the various nations, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the First Nations people of this land. Their elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge that their struggle was an anti-colonial struggle against any form of oppression, and we actually do support their right to self-determination and their own liberty as well, and recognise that their struggle is part of a broader struggle now against imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Throw Lenin in there. So tonight we're actually now studying, we're on to Chapter 7 on transportation policy and means of communication, and just as we've discussed, we'll go through a paragraph each, and once we end on the part about the maritime communication routes, we'll have a discussion and then we'll keep continuing on. So, Helen, would you like to kick off the first part of the paragraph, or the first paragraph? Sorry.
Yep. And just for anybody that might not have been following us in terms of this discussion, this is a document that was put out by an organisation called Peru Libre, which is actually the new government in Peru, just recently elected. So it's their ideological document, but also it talks about the things that they're going to do now that they're elected, what they're going to do to improve the country. And so far we've talked about the redistribution of wealth and the taxation of the wealthy. We've studied their education policy, their medical policy, and so now we're on to discussing the agricultural policy.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry, lost my place. Sorry, lost my place. All right, so on transportation policy and means of communication, Peru deserves to enter a stage of national, regional, and local road integration, modern and efficient, not to continue deprived of technological advances to defend stagnant monopolies that only see their interests and not that of the nation. The world has revolutionized this sector so much that any country that ignores it and does not march to the demands of a world in perpetual change will be condemned to permanent underdevelopment.
Land communication routes. We must achieve greater development of these roads along the vertical and horizontal axes of the country. For this, the management tools that have made the state a slow and obstructive entity must be modified, achieving an agile and efficient state where economic profitability, to be cut off there. Although it is important, it is not the only criterion to build roadworks, since we must assume other parameters such as the isolation of peoples, living borders, threats of drug trafficking and terrorism, the poverty index, etc. So the state can service them with the priority that they demand. Likewise, all legal contracts should be reviewed, especially those that favour transnational concessionaries of our roads and railways. Works built with our taxes, but that unfortunately we have to pay the most expensive tolls to use them.
The railway communication routes. This form of mass transportation is frequently used in other developed continents in which South America is lacking. We need to procure a modern railway that integrates the entire Peruvian coast in a matter of hours, a totally viable and profitable project in the same way. In the Peruvian jungle, where geography lends itself to installing this type of transport through its plains, unlike the previous ones, in our mountains there is peculiarity due to the Andes mountain range, where a rather rough geography predominates to promise a bullet train, due to the number of tunnels that would have to be done, but which is not inalienable. Like land concessions, rail concessions must be reviewed, renegotiated, or resolved.
Aeronautical communication routes. In a country marked by the Andes, the Amazon jungle, and the existence of innumerable towns in its interior, the aeronautical route represents par excellence an economic, modern, safe, and decisive route for the development of our peoples. No region should be devoid of an airport with international characteristics or with projection to it. Even so, its construction is in stages. Likewise, the state must recover its flag carrier. Since the neoliberal government was established, our air corridors have been sold at a ridiculous price and handed over mainly to the Chilean monopoly, exonerating them from taxes for a long time. And after the deadlines, they refuse to pay what they currently have to pay. The Chilean company Land Peru owes the state an amount of US dollars 440 million plus interest, and the amounts for tax debt amount to US dollars 914 million, equivalent to the annual budget of 10 regional governments.
Maritime communication routes. This issue will be addressed when the chapter concerning our territorial sea is reached. So I'm guessing they have a lot of agreements to make there, so they don't really have that much to say. I guess that reaches the end of the communication routes. Did you guys want to open up there to comments?
Go for it, Helen. Yep.
Well, so normally we read through the whole chapters and have a discussion, but this is particularly interesting. So we decided to change our normal mode of reading. So we've stopped halfway through to discuss this issue because Australia has, has a railway system that is fairly antiquated and really could do with an upgrade in terms of high speed rail. When we look at China and the development of their high speed rail system, their trains are moving, I think, at, correct me if I'm wrong, 400 to 500 kilometers an hour. Now in Australia, instead of going by plane across the great vast distances that Australia has, which of course is highly polluting, using more and more fossil fuels, we could develop a high-speed rail system that could take people all around Australia. It would be fantastic. At the moment, our railway system around Australia is more of a tourist entertainment rather than actually a form of travel.
And like if here in Victoria, they've been talking about a high-speed rail link, one the first one from Geelong to Melbourne for commuting, and then obviously looking at other regional areas. And the problem is with Australia, we're still relying on an 1860 steam aero alignment in a lot of places. Unfortunately, it took us well over 100 years to sort the railway gauges out. Unfortunately, now the national track work is the standard gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Where we used to be in between the mainland cities of Melbourne, Sydney, you'd have to change at Albury to change trains because of the different gauges. It was just a ridiculous concept for such a long time. That's something that could have been worked out amongst the 1800s. It could have been stepped in. No, we had to think about various separate colonial interests, and this is the problem we've had. It's like our railways were once a blessing, but it was revolutionary in sense in that time where you can transport things a lot faster, but it was also a curse as well. As long as it went faster than a bullock team, and two, we had the notorious different railway gauge systems, and it took us, as I said, over 100 years just to travel that up. It was a joke in the 1940s, especially the height of World War II. If you wanted to travel in Sydney to Perth, you'd travel Sydney to Broken Hill, change trains there, travel on a narrow gauge all the way down to Port Augusta, change trains there to the Commonwealth Railway standard gauge to Kalgoorlie, change then again to the narrow gauge Western Australia to Perth. How ridiculous could you get? And it was actually, we could have, without actually some persistent effort, and that's on behalf of everybody pulling behind, but even General Douglas MacArthur, when he came to Australia, made a big comment about that. That was a big problem to try and move transport and troops and everything up to Australia's north. You had to jump off at the railhead at Alice Springs, go up this dirt road to get to Larimer, back onto a narrow gauge train, which barely went faster than the Bullock team into Darwin. I mean, if Japan found a lot more, they would have moved quite quicker than they would have done. Very quickly. So,
yeah. I actually saw something the other day. It was a comparison image between the density of freeways in Europe versus the density of high-speed rail tracks in China. And one thing that really got me was that they were almost comparable in their density. So basically what China has done is they have constructed high-speed rail lines to the density of what Europe has for their freeways. And that just, once you see them side by side on the same scale, you notice what kind of a world of opportunity that offers to everybody, not just individuals, but just for business, for commerce, for industry and all that kind of stuff. And especially on a landmass as huge as Australia. Absolutely right, though. It's ridiculous that we're using standard different gauges for such a long time. And even since then, our trains are like painfully slow on the scale of our landmass to move people and cargo around.
And the thing, go on.
Well, I was just going to ask the question is, how much influence therefore has the fossil fuel industry got in determining the transportation mode of Australian goods? Clearly, on a sheer volume of traffic and the sheer volume size of this country, you would think that rail would be so much more efficient. And yet where we resort to having to truck things from Western Australia to Melbourne, it's crazy.
And that's the thing, and especially during where it's densely populated between Sydney and Melbourne. We're talking about a high-speed rail for a very long time, and it was always, we've had God knows how many feasibility studies, but every time it's like it gets shut down, it's promised. People know it's a good idea. People know it will work. But the reason being, we've got all these other industries, both the road transport, but also the airline as well. You can just imagine how much fuel the airline industry, one of the world's busiest airline routes, was between Sydney and Melbourne. And do you know how much jet engine fuel that's been consumed and CO2? But imagine it was an electric high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne, travelling at few hundred kilometres an hour. I mean, okay, it might not be there. It might be catching a train from Melbourne, Sydney, an hour and a half compared to what you would in a plane. But even with a plane, you've got waiting queues, a whole lot. But really much you're on a train, off you go. And go via Canberra. I mean, it makes common sense, just up through there. But even extending it through to right up through the east coast, north of Brisbane. But it'll actually take a lot of air traffic out of Australia and across Australia itself to Perth. Why can't we? The excuse is we don't have the population to sustain it. Well, in China, the difference is China builds it and it puts the population in to sustain it. So they build them big cities of a few million people, whatever, bigger than Sydney and Melbourne combined populations or whatever, and people commute, they get to everywhere.
Build it and they will come. Yeah.
Exactly. If you can get somewhere easily at super fast speeds, then why wouldn't you live in somewhere other than Melbourne or somewhere other than Perth?
Right. Yeah.
But right now, the only option you have to get from Melbourne to Perth or anywhere in between is to either drive or catch a plane or go on this rumbling tourist train that doesn't get you there fast enough. So, it's really a backward thing that we're dealing with in terms of railway.
But even like with the state of Victoria, I mean, for example, here in Bendigo, I mean, we live in central Victoria, the central part of mainland Victoria, and the geographical centre is only 14 kilometres just southeast of the city centre of the state. I won't get into that story, but the fact is, we're talking about improved rail services. Why don't we just put a high speed in? Connecting up some of the other major towns here, and we could commute to Melbourne, not even just within half an hour. At the moment, to commute to Melbourne, it takes us anything from an hour and 3/4, or hour and 45 minutes to just under 2 hours, depending if you're the express train and that depends on all the suburban traffic and everything else thrown in between. So, I mean, it makes sense.
I did a quick calculation based on the distance between Sydney and Melbourne and the speed at which the high-speed rail travels in China. And I figured out that if we were to implement a similar kind of system at the same kind of speed, it would be conceivable to get from Sydney to Melbourne in about half an hour.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, look, and we didn't even have to shoot that high. We would settle for going from Sydney to Melbourne in an hour and a half. Like, even that would be amazing, right? But just to give you an idea of what's possible and what actually is possible here today, just not in this country. It's not something that is a utopian kind of thing, pie in the sky type deal.
And we don't have to contend with, we've got a system anyway in place. We have a railway line everywhere in place. We just need to improve it. And it's not like we have, mountainous ranges that are really difficult to navigate through and so on. We have a couple or whatever, but anyway, we've got the infrastructure in place for the most part, and we just need to have the political will to use it.
You're right.
Yeah. And I think interesting also even about in terms of air travel, the fact that, at one stage the Australian government owned the airways, and now, just like in Peru, it's been sold off, amalgamated, and they were probably sold at ridiculous prices, and we're talking Ansett and so on. And you can guarantee that behind Qantas, there's multinational corporations, owning the Australian airways.
Well, and one of our government-owned ones was the Trans-Australian Airlines, and it was sold off in 1990. The privatised. Qantas was basically privatised as well. I mean, it's now owned by the CEO, Alan Joyce, and a lot of the shareholders there. Ansett no longer exists. I mean, obviously, we saw what happened with Ansett, although that was privately owned. At the end of the day, it was unfortunate that was sold off, and then Richard Branson stepped in and led up Virgin Australia. Now it's been bought out by someone else. And I remember last year when they granted the whole airline fleet of all the airlines because of COVID. The fact is, these companies were on the verge; they couldn't operate, even though they've earned billions of dollars in profits. They were on the verge of going broke, and basically there was a call to nationalise, but even the National Treasurer came out for Josh Frydenberg and says, "I am not nationalising it." Carrying on. Well, it would have been a good time to actually move in. All right, we're going to acquire all the assets now, and we're going to bring back a proper national carrier. We like to say Qantas is our national national carrier, but technically it's not. It's actually owned by major shareholders around the world, and it looks like it's in so-called Australian hands. It's not publicly owned. How can we call it a national carrier?
Was I getting confused? Was there another airlines that was owned by the Australian government? That was sold
up to
off?
1990. That was TAA, Trans-Australian Airlines.
I thought there was another one. I'm getting mixed up with something. Okay, so but like most things, transport is sold off to private enterprise. We see that with our trams, with our buses, rail, all of the things that that we built, we initially paid for, and then it gets sold off to private corporations for a fraction of what the cost is. I mean, companies can't build things like that kind of infrastructure. They simply don't have enough money over the period of time, and they don't want to invest in something that's so long term before you get a profit back from it. So governments do it for them, and then we sell it off to these private corporations to reap the profits from it. It's ridiculous.
And just for anyone who's watching who might be under the impression that they can point to a government-owned transport carrier or something, and they point to it and say, they run horribly. It's a horrible system. It's a horrible way that they run it. Well, that's the point. Under neoliberalism, they intentionally run these things at such a horrible management level to give you the worst possible experience, to develop the consent among the population to have it sold off to the highest bidder. And this is exactly what they do with the health system. This is exactly what they do with the postal system. any kind of government-owned service or infrastructure, they purposely run it into the ground so they can diminish whatever value is inherent in it and just sell it off to whoever wants to buy it.
Yeah.
And see, this is the thing as well. I remember when it was all a service for us. You know, there was the post service. It was corporatised. It was a service for the Australian people, along with telecom. When it before it was Telstra, it was actually there for a telecommunication service, along with the railways. They were a service, both for the transportation of goods and passengers, but they were a particular service. Everything was a service. And then they came on, they had to be run as a business. And first of all, some of it was corporatised, and that led to the next step on to completely privatise the whole sector. And I think there's very little public ownership now. I think Sydney still owns I think the state government still owns the Sydney Rail Network, but I believe there's been many years now to push to start privatising sections. They'll start bit by bit to privatise sections as well. I know they did that last year, didn't they? They privatised Sydney buses.
Buses, they did, yeah.
And look, the service on them now, it's obviously there was essential service, like elderly people would have used it. They're big users of public transport. But now what they'll be doing, oh no, we can't make profit out of that particular time or that timetable, whatever. So they're majorly disadvantaged because they're not able to access the services they need anymore in the name of profit.
Yeah.
That also feeds into what you were saying, Helen, before about pushing up the interests of the fossil fuel companies, car manufacturers, and all that kind of stuff. Because that feeds into the mentality like, oh well, public transport's horrible. It's never here when I want it. There's never the timetable that I want. The service is never run the way I want it. So I need a car. I need to contribute to this constant congestion on our roads.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Dave, you hit the nail on the head. This whole idea of profit, that everything needs to be run at a profit is the, is part of the reasoning behind selling it off, is because we can't make a profit. But, we have to remember that over the generation after generation after generation have paid for these services. And that's exactly right. They're services to the people. And we have paid for them over and over and over again through our taxes, through paying for the service when we use it. And so we have paid for it already. They are getting it at next to nothing from us, who have paid for it already through our taxes. And it doesn't have to run at a profit because it's being paid for by the people. And we've got to keep that in mind when we're talking about these services that are essential to the development of the country, but also to the well-being of the people.
Exactly.
All right. Shall we move on to
the next part of chapter 7, stop the concentration of media. Helen, do you want to kick that off?
All right. So stop the concentration of media. There is a high concentration of media in the hands of 3 companies that together dominate 84% of the market. Grupo Commercial has more than 60% of the revenues in the market, followed by Grupo ATV and Grupo Latina, Grupo standing for group. The Grupo Commercial, owned by Jose Granamiro Quesera, owns the newspapers El Comercio Peru 21, Gestión Trom Deport, Correo, Ojo Aja, and El Bocon, as well as Canal 4 American Television and Canal N. It also owns 15 digital media. So that whole kind of, by the sounds of it, all of those medias own, that one person owns all of those newspapers and as well as television.
Sounds
digital media.
Sounds like familiar, doesn't it? Rupert Murdoch, go and eat your heart out.
Yeah, exactly. As the concentration exists, it constitutes a true attack against the freedom of the press, expression and information, biasing its communication depending on its political, economic, financial and social interests, among others, affecting the pluralism of social thought and the right to freedom and citizen information. These groups are in the hands of families with construction business interests, and using their influence, they extort money from the state. Media concentration must not only be fought, but also prohibited?
National television and radio at the service of all levels of government. Currently, national television and radio are at the service of the central government. No space is considered for regional governments and less for local ones. In other words, it has been taken as private property at the service of the President of the Republic and his Council of Ministers. This exclusive reality can only be reversed with vigorous decentralisation. Doug?
The economic democratisation in private, state and alternative media. In Peru, the state finances the state media, but mainly the private media. The latter, unlike the former, receive enormous financing under the heading of advertising, which is estimated at 740 million per year, which implies an expenditure of 2 million per day for the owners of private media. In terms of cost and infrastructure, we could be equivalent to building 2 schools a day in the country. This circumstance shows the state money is essential for them to survive as a press. The private one is not enough for them, which contradicts their free market essence on the state paternalism that they paradoxically attack. It is clear that under the garment of publicity, what is really paid is a disguised bribe to maintain the system on which the government is based.
The Ecuadorian model and the government of Rafael Correro, in the face of similar circumstances, decided to democratize the payment of state advertising, breaking the monopolies. He executed the following formula: all 100% of 100% of the budget, 33% went to the public sector, 33% for the sector private, and 34% for alternative press. This helped to avoid the concentration of the media, guaranteeing the plurality for information for all political currents and manipulations of public opinion. In Peru, 85% of the budget has been directed to the owners of the media concentration, 50% to the public centre, and 0% to the alternative press.
Elimination of junk programs. Although some television, radio, and written media distort the minds of our new generations, the state cannot regulate them through the free market, broadcasting without protecting children and youth, since the state abdicated its protective role. The Ministries of Education and Culture must evaluate the contents of television and radio stations before broadcasting, thus avoiding an attack on the morals and good customs of Peruvian society. Dave?
Law that regulates the media. In a democratic state, everything is subject to law and free market or freedom of the press. Should not be confused with impunity. Certainly, a free press is vital for democracy, but contradictorily, a yellow press is fatal for it. The concentration of media damages democracy and the fight against corruption. The owners of these media are shareholders with up to 22% of the shares of the companies that were privatised, thus controlling economic, media, legal, political power and social opinion, contributing to the lack of transparency with which the state conducts itself. In reality, they become spokesmen for the national and foreign big business, distorting democracy. With Fujimori, we show that they are part of the highest level of corrupt system endorsing dictatorial regimes. This is the reason why the regulation law is necessary and thereby avoid the freedom of enrichment, blackmail, defamation, slander, and above all, lies. But this sector does not admit a regulatory law and has the support of international organisations entered by the US, such as the Inter-American Press Association, IAPA. Added to this is the cowardly, complicit action of Parliament.
So, well, I was just gonna stop us there and think, you know, how is this similar to what's going on in Australia with private media, and how much money are they receiving from the government through advertising? I have no idea how much that is.
Is that information even public is what I want to know. You know, because they work in concert together so tightly, I would be surprised if such a comprehensive figure was made public.
Yeah,
so, I mean, look, David mentioned Rupert Murdoch before, and you know, obviously that's no secret. Everybody knows just how much of a monopoly his media empire has in this country. It also extends into the UK and America as well. We know that he owns most of the newspapers. He's got a big slice of the TV channels. If you want cable here in Australia, you 90% of your choices is Foxtel, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch majority anyway. And mind you, that was a huge reason as to why our national broadband network was pretty much cut off at the knees at its inception, because it was deemed as a natural competitor to Rupert Murdoch's legacy industries like television and radio and newspapers. So it's very well known and very well documented that Rupert Murdoch lobbied the government at the time to hamstring it and make sure that it didn't become a serious competitor. So now we have substandard broadband for the foreseeable future.
Now, and all we see is too, the Murdoch media has been the mouthpiece for a particular section of the political class, really, and basically when we do watch the news, and be it anywhere, the other channels as well, including the ABC, all we do is get the ruling class point of view. Everything's so corrupted, nothing's transparent, nothing. And obviously, we're talking about, there's talk about a federal, was it ICAC, which is what the Independent Commission Against Corruption. I mean, at the end of the day, it's probably, if they do have something genuinely independent and funded, it would probably pull the whole political establishment to pieces all of a sudden. But the media would still try and cover up and everything else. And I even see during this time of COVID, whether it be with the state premiers or with the Prime Minister, no one's asking the hard questions at all. It's all basically Dorothy Dixer questions, or really, it looks like the attempt to really trying to question them hard, but they're not really going for the jugular at all and really asking them really questions and what agenda that's happening here. It's just basically, when we look at it, I can't blame people who don't even bother watching the news anymore. When people say we don't know what to believe anymore, because they know full well they're just basically being lied to. It's more than the government's lie, but it's just been highlighted through the media even more. I mean, that's why a lot of people in this country have got distrust of government. I mean, it might be part of our gene pool, but the reality is they don't trust anymore. That's why there's questions about the vaccine, there's questions about this, everything. Why should anyone trust them anymore? So if Rupert Murdoch's media come along, this is good, take it. Why would you? Would you buy a used car from that man? No. If he said the sale was coming up tomorrow, you'd go and seek a second opinion.
It's interesting to know with that distrust. That's not the only pathway of distrust. Obviously, there's also, instead of the government combating distrust with legitimate reasons to trust them, they combat this distrust of the public by inspiring even more distrust between workers. And this is a very big part of the media establishment, because, as we all know, with shows like A Current Affair and 60 Minutes, how many times have we seen segments? It's like they have on a rotation, like, shonky tradies, or dole bludgers, or immigrants. It's like they spin the wheel. It's like, which one are we going to do this week? And it's almost it's predictable enough that it's almost a comedy. But it's unfortunately it's not, and it causes real damage in our communities, and it causes us to distrust each other and point our anger away from that government oversight and that monopoly that's keeping us under the thumb.
And the other thing too,
I think that's crucial.
And it's also how it portrays working class people in the areas, like immigrant communities that are either associated with working class people with crime gangs or just generally stupid, don't know much. And this was a class. This happened many years ago, and I forget who exposed it, but A Current Affair, I think it was A Current Affairs. It was one of those reports either Channel 7 or Channel 9, actually put a car there in a shopping centre car park in Mount Druitt, because they want to do this big hype thing about crime, right? People, thieving cars. So Mount Druitt, and obviously demonise everyone that lives in Mount Druitt. And they left it there, wasn't even touched. So they even put the keys in the ignitions with the windows down. They kept filming, tried to be undercover. No one touched it. No one absolutely touched it. They had to get someone to act as a car thief. It was actually exposed of what they were trying to do, so they could put this sensational story out there. And it's like, people get sick of it at the end of the day. And I remember back in the early 2000s in Macquarie Fields there in Sydney, when I was living in Sydney, there was massive riots breaking out where the Housing Commission owned, and it was actually a form of class struggle. It was very anti-authority against the establishment, and unfortunately, I wish there was a lot more Marxist thinking in there. But these kids were interviewed, but they told the media F off. They just gave them what they're for and all to them. And all these social workers trying to have interviews, and they said, and then these kids actually said, we know who our enemies are. And they actually had class war by any means necessary. They actually said, we know who they were. These kids were sick and tired of being ripped off by employers. They were ripped off how they were treated by the whole system and everything else. It was actually a show that would have been good for us to tap into. Into these people. The whole distrust of the media. They literally go, what for? And and so it even showed that. Showed it. So.
And I just wanted to touch on what he was talking about, or what this document's talking about in terms of state money going to the media, and we know that Rupert Murdoch's press will be receiving funding from the Australian government, which essentially means it's from the taxpayers of Australia, because the private system, they don't make enough money out of the private system, so they have to get funding from the government to run their corporate business, and that points to the very fact that this system doesn't work. The free market does not work. We're subsidizing just about everything, every corporation, and we did it through the cars. We did it. Toyota got financed. Bloody Ford got financed. There'll be some money going to Qantas to keep it financed. There'd be money going to everybody else except for the infrastructure that benefits the working class. So the free market economy is constantly being money from the government is constantly being funneled into the free market to keep the system going, because without it, this system could not exist. It cannot make enough money for the likes of corporations to survive without government funding.
Exactly.
Yeah,
we also see this. Just give me one more. I have to actually close my back door. I've got this cold draft coming in. Keep going.
Yeah, so I was going to say this is also plays. It's also why clickbait is also a huge problem in the last few years on social media. Is that we have it's like an erosion of journalism. Journalism, as it's strictly defined, almost doesn't even exist anymore, because they have to constantly optimize for fear and outrage, and for clicks, basically, because clicks equal advertising revenue equal profit. And this is the only way that they can keep these things running, according to them. So it's when you think about having the media being privately run, is it really in our public interest if they have a constant incentive to warp and distort what is actually happening in reality in service of getting these clicks and ad revenue?
And that, today we were talking about it during work, and somebody said, oh, there's X amount of cases in Geelong today, blah 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 of COVID, of course, and somebody else piped up and said, but why don't they tell us how many people are going into hospital? Why don't they tell us how many people are really sick in ICU or died? They might say one person died or two people died or whatever, but and not that we want to know those details, but all they tell us is X amount of people have got it. X amount of people got it. It's that real sensationalizing and fear that they're putting into us that, that is not necessary. But of course, that's what sells the media. That's what sells. And it has it has more than one motivation behind their stories. One is to keep us afraid. The other is to keep us misinformed about what's really going on, and to divide and rule us and create that chaos amongst us, so that we're fighting ourselves, and also to keep us really ill-educated, really poorly educated, because if you're just sensationalizing things, then we are responding with our emotions. We're not responding with logic. We're not being educated by the kind of media that we have. And that's a real danger for us. So we're highly reactive emotionally, and we're highly we're super critical of each other as a result of that, because if you don't agree with me, then you must be wrong, because the media says, you're all idiots or whatever. And the name calling that's beginning, that now is so prevalent amongst young people, and the way that they criticize each other for their political differences is completely different than what used to go on. And go back 30 years sort of thing. People would have logical discussions and extremely fierce discussions about politics and so on, but there wasn't that name calling, if you like, or what's the word for it?
Character assassination.
Exactly.
It wasn't as toxic.
Yeah, and it comes directly from the type of media that we have.
Yeah.
And I guess by being vague enough, by saying, "Oh, this is how many people have got it," in your example, Helen, it also gives ultimate leeway to this polarization that the media preys upon. To have it both ways. So, X amount of people have got it. You got, people in Group A who say like, "Oh, that's because the vaccine doesn't work," and people on the other side in Group B say like, "Oh, that's because we didn't all do our part," and there are people that are, that aren't paying attention to the rules and breaking the rules and blah blah blah. And like, the number itself may be true, but because they're lying by omission, that gives us ultimate scope whatsoever to insert our very favorite conspiracy theories, our very favorite pet biases, and all that kind of stuff. So, it's a very intentional strategy, I think, and it optimizes for that media infiltration.
Yeah, and actually, further on too, we should add it is the social media side of things, the Facebooks of the world. I mean, obviously, there's a Senate inquiry in the US. I don't know if you heard what's happened about Facebook. There was a Facebook whistleblower. I did watch that 60 Minutes episode, the American 60 Minutes episode on YouTube. It was interesting, but it was stuff that we already knew about. And even when Republican and Democrat senators were questioning them, or Congress people, and we're questioning them, the fact is saying, that is all bad. But this is capitalism as well. This is what it's said to do. But the whole idea of character assassination, the whole lot, and I don't know if you just heard, there was a state member of parliament. She represents the Reason Party there in Victoria. She's had to close her whole social media platform down because she was being threatened basically, and even her staff were just like played on their mental health so bad. They were up to all hours of the night trying to delete all this nasty comments and that, using her as all sorts of crimes, and just actually with direct threats and that. And these platforms also enhance this all. And basically, when you look at the mainstream media, but also in the social media, the play on people's mental health is huge. No wonder we got extreme mental health problems exacerbated by an economic catastrophe. It's just basically, it's just really putting a lot of people down and keeping people down all the time, and it's disgraceful. And I think congratulations to Peru if they want to start doing something about this and totally turning the whole thing upside down. We're starting again and basically stuff you to the private sector. Put some real news out for once.
Which leads on to the next chapter, if you'd like me to carry on.
Yes, certainly.
It starts with exercise of journalism and freedom of the press. So the right wing, I guess, refers to freedom of the press as a vital element of democracy, a moralizer of society, and a constant reminder of the parameters for living in a democracy. They speak of their noble mission to ensure that the people are well informed. They acidly criticize the socialist countries for not practicing this vital principle to maintain social peace and human freedom, when in reality, they do the opposite. The media are powerful instruments of domination, of cultural hegemony, so the right wing has the ability to make the poor believe that what benefits them also benefits the working class, the poor. Under the terms of freedom, society allows anyone to assume the profession of journalist. There is no minimum requirement for someone to take a microphone on the air and start their business using blackmail as a method, whose victims are in front of frontline politicians and then democracy. A society that aims at media seriousness must demand that journalism be assumed by professionals who have a deontological training and put an end to unethical and commercial improvisation. Socialism does not advocate for press freedom, but for the press committed to the education and cohesion of its people, just as in reality the right does not believe in press freedom either, but rather in the press committed to the economic interest, business and financial, because when it notices the existence of an enemy, it chooses to attack it or make it invisible from its agenda.
Inter-American Press Association. It is an NGO founded in 1943 whose headquarters are in the US, depends on funds from foundations and integrates the owners of newspapers, magazines and news agencies in America, numbering more than 1,300. They refer to defending press freedom and journalists' rights, but in reality they represent interests of the economic, business and financial groups of America. Unmasked by leftist presidents Kirchner and Correa and other intellectuals, it behaves like an anti-socialist trench. The IAPA wrote the famous Declaration of Chapultepec that Ecuador refused to sign, despite slandering it as an enemy of freedom of expression. Correa described the IAPA as a promoter of the new Cold War, in charge of the systematic media, political, social and economic attack to wear down and thus defeat progressive governments, particularly in South America, financed by the CIA. The presidency of the Peruvian Gustavo Mujer Seminario is the owner of the newspaper La República and shareholder of America Televisión. It is the duty of the socialist state to become independent from this organization that concentrates continental media power to defend the economic power of the American oligarchy, because they know that political war today is communicational, according to Correa. The media have replaced political parties.
The legacies of Lenin and Fidel. Lenin had a great reason when he stated that true freedom of the press in a society is only possible when it is freed from the yoke of capital. Likewise, Fidel stated, the problem is not that they lie, the problem is how we tell the truths, invoking us not to have hope that the left will use the means of the right to make its revolution, because what remains here is a creativity of the masses. About the mission of journalism and socialism, he said, the truth in our times sails through stormy seas, where the mass media are in the hands of those who threaten human survival with their immense economic, technological and military resources. Correa reminded us that when the Spanish arrived in America, territorial and cultural colonization began. But this would not be easy without the participation of a political, media and propaganda ally, which in this case was and continues to be the Catholic Church. While they destroyed our cultures and executed native leaders, invoked obedience and baptism, offering salvation in heaven. In reality, this is the media power that has now mutated into the IAPA. It also reminds us that the mother of all battles will be communicational. When the right holds a meeting, when the right wing holds a meeting, does not have a call, but has its means of communication, the greatest power in the entire world, a powerful instrument to manipulate the masses. For this, the militants must understand that the communication process is permanent.
That's pretty heavy, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
There's some heavy blows in that one there.
Yeah. And it should remind us that, you know, the propaganda and the difficulty in combating that propaganda is hard. It's hard for the left to do it. We're limited in our language, because so much of our language has been, in terms of left-wing language or the way we talk to workers, we're so now restricted in how we talk to workers, because if we talk the same way as the right does, you know, using words like freedom and democracy, and nationalism and patriotism and, you know, things like that, but then we end up sounding like the right wing. And so our language is becoming more and more restricted, and that alienates workers from us, because they can't understand what we're saying. And we're saying it in such a way that we don't want to sound like the right wing. But they've worked it, the media has worked it so well that they've stolen the language of the people and using it to boost up capitalism in the eyes of the people.
Yeah.
Somehow we've got democracy. Somehow we'll have freedom. If we go on a, rampage against a vaccine, we'll have freedom. Well, what kind of freedom will we have? What is it freedom from?
The freedom to die from an infectious disease.
Yeah. And the other thing as well, how they manipulate, when they even say those on these groups are saying, mandatory jabs or whatever sort of type authoritarian, that's communism. And they're trying to even demonise that and trying to look at China being the big boogeyman in all this. But what they're actually not explaining is, and I've actually already pulled a few people in line, I said, they don't have mandatory vaccination in China. Neither do they have it in DPRK. They don't have it in Cuba. They don't have it in Vietnam. Neither do they have it in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, Peru, or anyone else that aspires to socialism. They don't have mandatory jabs there. They have a very good, obviously like Cuba, they have a very good health system and the ability to treat it as well. Yes, they have vaccines, and they are doing further study in there as well. But isn't that strange that? But when they start using, they do it. No. Well, and when I get asked how China handle it, I said they handle it very well from the start. They actually built hospitals. They got into it straight away. This is what they're not telling you. And yes, that's socialism. Yes. That's what it does. It looks after its population and people. It becomes a priority, not the priority of the pharmaceutical companies or any other multinationals benefiting from this so far. So that's fundamental difference. We'll probably now get cancelled from social media after this show for saying such things. Lambasted. I just want to make sure for the audience, no, I'm not any vaccinated by jabs, but look, as I said, if it's up to people, have got to make an informed choice on that, and a proper one as well, and not being told you must go and get vaccine. So there, in fact, we should actually turn it back onto them. We say, well, that's Nazism for you. That's fascism. That's what that does. So,
that would be more accurate, yeah.
Actually, we should actually turn around to them and say, that's capitalism for you. That's your capitalist freedom, where you don't have a choice. Mm-hmm. Well, you do have a choice. You either do that or you don't have a job. Simple. There's your choice.
Yeah. I just found it really, really great how Correa actually did say the media have replaced political parties. And I thought that is such a great way and such a very concise way to reveal a huge amount of truth. Because essentially that's how they operate. They operate as the media, as the reality distortion field of our society, and they also have. It's not because they want to. They have any kind of interest to the public good or anything like that. It's because they have an interest to the owning class interests, big business interests, and that's where they think freedom of the press is to maintain those interests. And whenever it comes to our interests, they don't want to push it, or they selectively ignore it.
And I think the start of the paragraph where it says the media are powerful instruments of domination, of cultural hegemony. So the right wing has the ability to make the poor believe that what benefits them, the rich, also benefits them, the working class. And it's amazing how we can assume how we can adopt the position of the right of the ruling class and think that somehow we are the same as them when we have nothing in common with them whatsoever, and none of what they do benefits us. They are doing it for their benefit, and they want us not to rebel against that. So they try and induce us into a coma through the media to believe that somehow we all have the potential to be like them, when in fact we don't. We don't have.
Yeah, they want us to be convinced that we're somehow temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I scroll through my various news feeds on all my social media accounts, at least one time, every time I scroll through them, I see at least one or two articles in there by that are suggested. Right, these aren't places or accounts that I've added or anything like that. Suggested articles where it's like, oh, this person was a homeless person, now he's a billionaire, or this person came from poverty and now they own 14 houses. See how they did it? And it's just this is such an obvious propaganda mill to sort of really reinforce the definition of neoliberalism, to say, look, no, it's fine. You can, if you just work hard enough, you can become a billionaire. Anyone can become a billionaire. When the reality is the opposite. You know, we have most people working their whole lives down to the bone, and for what? For nothing, just so they can continue paying rent. And it's very much a reality distortion field that social media in particular does very well.
Yeah. That's
and
right.
interesting that they go on to say that anybody can assume the profession of journalist, just grab a microphone and get on air. And of course, that's what social media is so much full of, is just grab a microphone, start your business, and people take it as gospel somehow. There's no truth behind it. There's no research behind it. They're not professionals. They're not journalists. They just what are they selling? Their body?
They're just glorified vloggers, basically.
What are they doing? You know?
Then
so
also,
our media, sorry.
And also too, I mean, it's when they. I think Caleb Walper was talking about this the other day. What was IG stand for? I think it was information or something like that. Anyway, I made
something
it up.
Green.
Yeah, something like that. Anyway, so IG actually means intelligence gathering as well, and actually everyone agreed it's a great way to actually gather people's profiles, because what they're actually doing in social media and our other media platforms is actually in all your details, not just be your date of birth and what you look like, but they're looking at what they're trying to do, what they can corporations can market to you as well. But it's also what details you say. Like, for example, anything, the Facebook's a classic example. If you could put something up on Facebook, it becomes publication, right? Facebook owns it. Even if you've deleted it, it's still publication. Even if it's a closed private group, it's still publication. Facebook owns it. And they obviously sell it. But also, too, there was, remember, I think it was over, how many years ago? It wasn't that long ago. It was last decade. I think it was Barack Obama was still president. About the NSA, the National Security Agency, actually collecting everyone's data on social media. And remember what you said, be it on your Twitter account, on your Facebook at the time, there's many more platforms now, but it's also, on a Gmail, how much of the information they're gathering. And it's just it was really sinister stuff. And it's basically, IG, intelligence gathering of everybody. And what it gets me as well, you could put a good alternative opinion out there, say something, and you can be kicked off for say it doesn't meet the community standards. The longest I've been kicked off was for 5 days. It's only because I made a threatening or made a remark about the Prime Minister. Basically, someone was criticising, people making these comments, and I said, someone should shoot them. Like that, and I wrote on there, bang, that was. And I was kicked off via Facebook for 5 days. I didn't know until 3 days later. Still couldn't get in. So 3 days later, and they said, you will abide by community standards and blah, blah, blah. Yes, okay, you can get me back on there. I was in. But I deleted that. Someone said, surprised you didn't have the federal cops kicked down your door. It was just a remark. But this is what I mean. This is the sort of stuff they're going about. I mean, that's just typically what we used to say many years ago. Someone should not take it back and shooting or give them a hiding, and so say that now on social media, it's like nearly a public crime. And but the other things as well, when people do put alternative views out there, classic ones was when we've had people like well-known more commentators, Mignal Laham, there's people, there's a young Syrian girl, Partisan, many others. About times they got booted off social media because they could put a very big condemnation of Western government policies and as well. And so it just shows. It comes to show just the power and control these have. So be it from Rupert Murdoch or Silicon Valley.
It wouldn't surprise me if this recent episode with the Facebook whistleblower on that 60 Minutes segment, if they use this as a consent sort of to really clamp down on some of these rules on Facebook even further. Because as much as what this woman is saying, it might be true, it is a very sort of sympathetic story, which a lot of people can agree with and be outraged over. And let's not forget how much the media loves outrage, especially when it comes to generating consent for something. So, I mean, while the facts on the ground may be true, we all know that the government's never turned down, a good, a sad story or a good outrage story, they never let it go to waste. They'll give police extra powers. They'll enforce extra censorship whenever it's convenient for them. So yeah, we'll see what happens, but wouldn't surprise me at all.
All right. All right. Did we want to start with the next chapter, chapter 7, or still having this discussion on the media? We covered a lot tonight so far. What I was just going to suggest, we can just read through them. They're just all the various policies, I think, so we can read that up to chapter 8, so it won't take that long. Ellen, again, did you want to kick it off?
Sure. Chapter 7, Agricultural Policy as National Security. The agricultural sector has a special agenda in our program that will ensure, from the increase of the budget, the technification, promotion of ecological agriculture and expansion of the agricultural frontier to guarantee the internal and external market. Agricultural budget. If the state does not decide to support agriculture as a vital element of survival in times of peace and war, it will not have food security for its urban or rural people. We have been surprised how the state supports the regions differently in the sector, making coastal agriculture for export pay greater attention to the mountains and the jungle.
Agricultural technification. I love that word. We must initiate an agricultural technological modernization, establishing agreements with national and foreign companies to save efforts and man-hours in the field. At this moment, only 2 regions have a state soil laboratory for our farmers. The rest have to resort to private laboratories, increasing their expenses. Expansion of the agricultural frontier. The uncultivated lands of the state must be endowed with water by planting trees, irrigation canals, dams, transferring rivers, etc., for their respective exploitation and increase in agricultural yield. The lands that were improperly sold must return to the state, as well as the banks of the rivers that have been invaded. Dave?
Sowing water. The state must endeavour to create large water reservoirs, irrigation canals, afforestation programs, reforestation, and combat overgrazing, etc., to prevent the shortage of the liquid element. That's an interesting one, the liquid element. In addition, the state must initiate technological feasibility studies for the desalination of seawater. Special projects. These aspirations must be decentralised to regional governments to obtain better afforestation, communication routes, and control over illegal logging and avoid their concessions by government centralism, especially in our Peruvian jungle. Helen.
Agro-export. Currently, the neoliberal state, having turned us into a consumer society, cares little about agricultural production, and if there is support, it is for the coast destined for export. The socialist state must implement a policy that guarantees the internal consumption without neglecting external agricultural exports in order to change our sad nutritional situation. Food safety. It is important to create the political, legal, scientific, economic, military and social framework regarding food security, since socialist states are frequent victims of economic food siege by the great powers. So it is worth reaffirming that the resource water will be geared towards food security rather than mining.
Registration of cocoa farmers. Until now, there is no political will from the central government to register cocoa leaf farmers, which leads to an increase in informality, drug trafficking, and the suspicion that every producer is involved in this crime. Likewise, the industrialization of the cocoa leaf for medicinal and nutritional purposes must be carried out, making its benefits known at the national and global level, declaring it as the heritage of the Peruvian people. Formalization of land titling. There are many Peruvians who live in anxiety and anguish because they do not have the legal security of their lands, and in contrast, we see that traffickers are appropriating communal lands. The first condition is seen in human settlements, and the second in the appropriation of land to promote private real estate projects. Reclaim agricultural land from irrigation projects. The beneficiary lands of the large public investment projects such as Olmos, Mejesihuas, Chinecas, Gaito Ciego, Gabomochic, etc., were made with the spirit of benefiting the agricultural people. However, before the project was completed, they were concessioned to foreign and national capital. The people had their lands confiscated in some of these projects under the pretext that they were uncultivated, the same that after the execution of the project became highly fertile for which they transferred water from lakes, lagoons, and rivers, privatizing in the practice all these sources.
Encourage livestock, activity that goes hand in hand with agriculture and is the pillars of the country's food security, especially for the most needy classes. We must promote its preservation and improvement as a state, since in the face of any threat of food blockade, it is the larger livestock that guarantees the feeding. Currently, large companies such as the Gloria Group exploit our farmers, buying a litre of milk at $1 or 1.20 sols or soles and selling it once processed for 3 soles. If the state industrialised this dairy product, it would surely pay our farmers better and sell it at a more comfortable price.
Exactly. I like the word when they talked about social projects. They said that the aspirations must be decentralised to regional governments, and I think that word decentralised is important for us. As progressive people thinking about how we could change our society. Decentralization means moving it away from all the decisions away from the main government and putting it back into the hands of the regional areas or into the hands of the people to make decisions for themselves. And really that's the crux of that grassroots powers. And we can build democracy and grassroots power through the decentralization of the government. And I think that's a crucial thing for us to try and grapple with and use more of, so that we can start to maybe encourage grassroots movements, the development of grassroots movements in Australia.
Yeah, and it also makes sense too, because different areas of the country, obviously going to have different resources and different environmental conditions and whatnot. And so obviously the people of those areas, especially Indigenous people, would be in the best position possible to know how to better take care of and harvest or exploit or grow these resources.
Well, and that's the thing. And I'm looking at something for here in Australia, which is such a dry continent, and we've instead of like we're talking about sowing, in Peru they're talking about sowing water. Well, here it would be different. Obviously, water management is a huge issue, and water itself. At times where we're not in drought at the moment, it's great to see the Menindee lakes full and rivers flowing and everything nice and green. But during times of drought, how are we going to look at this? And currently under the current system, while everything's geared for big pharma, towards massive amounts of profits and everything else, well, we're going to further land degradation, water being stored into massive reservoirs where basically the smaller farmers are pushed out of the markets. They have to sell off their land or whatever. And also too, the other interesting, the environment suffers as well, but also the cultural connection for the First Nations people. And I've just finished reading a book called Dark Emu. It was actually it's not the actual book itself, but it was more or less exemplified version. It's quite interesting, and just how during ancient times First Nations people had a massive wheat belt that went right through Australia, in through the inland and everything else, and how they actually farmed. And it wasn't people understand they weren't a hunter-gatherer society. They were an actual proper agricultural society. They had built structures, everything. They knew how to actually build proper fish traps and how to do things completely different. That wasn't the conventional European way. But basically, they knew how to do terrace-type gardening as well, or farming on hills and that. You could actually see the remnants of that in Victoria. You see stones are scattered around, would have been part of stone structures and all that, but with the lines in the hills and that was part of their terraced gardening and all that, and how they actually farmed in that. It was actually quite interesting. So the whole thing, and I think it's something we should learn for something to adapt to Australia, where this conventional European style farming. We all know, well, our topsoil is very, very thin compared to what they would in Europe. We need to look at different ways of how we cultivate and look at different ways and cultivation methods. Yeah, and this is good for, well, because when I was reading this out, and okay, this applies for Peru, I can understand why they need to do it, and a lot of undeveloped land, but also a lot of land's just gone to waste for cash crops, the whole lot, so they can actually gear that to the benefit of society. And I think we've got to look at our side of it, and a lot of our land and all that's cultivated for what we call the cash crop for export market. So we actually learn to cultivate it back in for the benefit of the people instead.
Yeah, it always boggles my mind every time I hear the statistics around how much of our resources, particularly water, goes into maintaining a cash crop of cotton. And I'm like, this is the least. It makes the least amount of sense to do that here in Australia, as in a continent as arid as ours. And you just realise that the only way this could ever happen is because this is literally just for profit. It's not for people to use. It's not for people that need it or anything like that. It's just literally strictly to make money from. And considering the amount of food that we import into Australia every year, we should not be that reliant on our imports for food. We are an arid country, but if we optimize our resources sufficiently, we should be able to grow enough food here and that's not only abundant but profitable. Sorry, not profitable. Accessible and plentiful for people to eat.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And for the Indigenous communities, and not suggesting that I know how they would harvest food or anything, but the support from central government for those for projects for them to develop, a resource so that they can, have a plentiful supply of food, rather than shipping it up from Perth or from Darwin or places where they're charging exorbitant prices, and that should never happen. That would never happen under a socialist government. But at the moment they have no way of growing their own crops or growing, getting their own food sources, or and so their local shop is able to sell things at exorbitant rates. It's just horrendous, the situation that First Nations people are in. It's in remote communities. It's criminal. It's absolutely criminal.
And not only that, it's a lot of the food that is produced for the supermarkets. I mean, a lot of it goes to waste. There's even good food that before goes to waste because it didn't look like an apple didn't look particular shape and size, everything else, and it's just amount of it it just gets buried or turned into some sort of waste product or whatever. It is criminal when you think about it. And even with meat and everything else. Now, someone made comment to me when this whole trade stoush with China took off last year. They put tariffs on our beef and everything else, and so people were making comment, we'll have plenty of cheap beef then, plenty of cheap meat. And I said, no, that won't. In fact, the price of it will go, all that meat and that will either just be buried, or they'll turn into blood and bone or whatever or something else, but they will not and put the market in there so people can actually buy plenty of it, maybe freeze it and use it for a later date, etc. That's it's not going to happen. Same with milk, same with anything else around there. When people think we're going to all of a sudden glut cheap food, all of a sudden we're able to afford, everyone will be able to eat. No, that'll be a waste. And and I'm looking at this, and I'm just thinking, we have a massive radical rethink about how we go about our agricultural business as well, our agricultural art and cultivation. We should be looking at that, and of course, as I said, water resources is a scarce thing. You're right. Why the hell are we growing cotton? Why can't we be growing hemp too? Hemp's really good because it sucks a hell lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. It puts a lot of good stuff in the ground. It actually cleans your soil. And not only that, it's used for multiple purposes. And we could actually have new industry. No, it doesn't need much water, but you can have a decent paper. You can make all sorts of products from hemp. And I'm talking about the stuff where people think, people go and get smoke. I said, well, you need to smoke quite a few acres before you ever get a slight hit off it. But good luck to you. Good luck to you. Good luck to you doing that. But, it can be used for all sorts of things, from building products, medicinal. It can be used for making clothing. You name it, furniture, all sorts of stuff. So and fuel. Instead of us having to drill for oil and gas all the time, we can use that as a biofuel. is another class. There's so many uses for it, and I'm just there thinking, all this has gone to waste, so we could just be an export geared market where no one's benefiting at all.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and again, who's deciding making these kind of decisions that cotton should be grown in Australia? Who's influencing those kind of decisions? It wasn't always grown here. It's only been in recent times that cotton's been allowed to be grown, or that's been ventured into. Whereas we could be putting resources into studying the soil in our arid areas and the types of grains and food that type of soil supplies, and we could be learning how to increase that yield for that particular area. But instead we invest in cotton, which has no benefit to Australia whatsoever. It's all exported. It's making huge amounts of profit for some multinational corporation. And just an interesting sideline, and I think I mentioned this the other day. Land in Western Australia is being bought up at an exceptional rate, an absolutely exceptional rate. And I think that we're going to find that there will be some kind of agribusiness, whether it's cotton, whether it's something else, that will be planted in Western Australia. So watch this space, and it'll be interesting. So that's in one of the drier regions around York and so on, but just outside of Perth. But yeah, watch the space and see what develops out of that. But again, that raises the issue of biosecurity, in the sense that Australia, we need to protect the security that we have because of for food. Because if we did want to change our system, if we did become, have an independent foreign policy, if we did become an independent country away from our allies, the United States and Britain, then we would find that we would be under the same type of attack as countries like Venezuela and Cuba that have decided they want to go an independent way away from capitalism to socialism. So we would find that we would have that same attack upon our food sources as well. And we need to shore up the way that we produce food so that we can look after the people when that should arise.
Yeah, you can't eat cotton.
Yeah, and I think, look, food security is essential must for every nation. It should not be up to the likes of multinationals to make profit off it. Food is a fundamental part of human survival. That's one of the, and I think, look, at the end of the day, leaving it up to multinationals and government policy and that to look after our food supply, I think basically, you're doomed really, tied to their system. And I think it's actually on this too with COVID breaking last year. Food security was one of the issues. Our food production, along with medical production, all that was brought up to it. And the question was, why have we got all these multinationals in our food supply? We should be actually back under public ownership. This is where it's essential. You might have some private interest in there, but not like the mass scale we have. This is just ridiculous,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I think we can probably call it a night, unless we just want to do that one last little bit on Chapter 8 on environmental policy and call it a night. It's only like just 2 pages, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, might as well.
All right. Well, I'll kick it off this time. Chapter 8, and we'll just read that. Once again, read a paragraph each, and we'll leave it at that for the night. Chapter 8 on environmental. The defence of conservation of the environment constitutes for socialism one of the columns where it is held in contrast to the diametrically opposite of neoliberalism. Ecological economic, or EEZ, the regions must develop their own EEZ with real autonomy, without interference from the central government, demarcate their protected and intangible areas, their water, agriculture, solid waste, exploitable and non-exploitable natural resources, etc., under citizen control. To preserve protected areas, budgets for guards, rangers, park rangers, vehicles and communications must be guaranteed.
Illegal logging They must decentralise powers and competencies to subnational and regional governments and municipalities to fight against illegal and indiscriminate logging, which must operate under citizen control. Penalties should be increased for offenders compared to today's paternalistic penalties. Currently, 25% of the Peruvian Amazon rainforest has been deforested. Drug trafficking. Yeah. The fight against this global threat must be more forceful, since it turns fertile lands into wastelands, pollutes lands and water, deforests the jungle by building airports, heliports, roads, etc., without social purpose, destroys flora and fauna, pollutes the air, raises the cost of living, and brings hitmen.
New sustainable regional curriculum. Document that incorporates greater awareness regarding caring for the environment, creating sustainable habits, values, and principles. This work must be complemented with the active participation of the media of the state and private sector, establishing the diffusion of free spots in favour of sustainable living as a contribution to their social obligations. Processing plants for waste. The treatment of solid and liquid waste must be guaranteed by each regional and municipal government in a mandatory manner. The reason why this policy has failed at present is because the centralist government does not guarantee budgets for this purpose and leaves all responsibility to the subnational governments. So,
ban on privatising water. Woohoo! The new constitution must strictly prohibit the privatisation of water, as endorsed by the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. In our countries, the water or irrigation boards have been empowered, having privatised it in practice, to continue controlling the people, the peasants, under the blackmail of being sanctioned if they do not attend a political march, under threat of a fine and water cut. The new constitution must seek to free small farmers, not only from bad businessmen, but also from bad leaders. On extractivism, extractivism, we must make clear that the fight against environmentalism or fundamentalist environmentalism, who believe that overcoming extractivism is to stop taking advantage of our non-renewable natural resources. A country like ours, which has no companies or industries, only has the opportunity to emerge from the underdevelopment thanks to sustainable and responsible extractivism as an alternative to irresponsible, unsustainable neoliberal extractivism. Sorry, I'm trying to... Extractivism. Okay.
Can we stop and have a wee bit of a discussion about that?
Yeah, go for it.
Because this is something I think that is important to understand as well. You know, there is the fight against extractivism, which basically means taking all of the mineral wealth out of the ground. You know, like everything, there's a contradiction within extractivism, and that is that on the one hand, you know, you've got mining by big multinational corporations that are taking as much as they can and giving very little back for it, you know, in terms of taxes even, and the destruction that they cause to the environment as a result of their mining and so on. But on the other hand, the contradiction is that, you know, in the hands of the people or in the hands of the socialist state, then that extractivism, it's important. It's important because we can't build without taking things from the ground. And the development of humankind has been that we've exploited the natural resources that we have on this planet Earth. The trouble with multinational corporations, like I said, is that they have no concept of taking only as much as they need and leaving the rest alone. They just keep taking and taking and taking. Whereas, you know, I think there's an important distinction what a socialist government and how we would manage extractivism and mining and so on.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's any good. You know, it's a difficult subject to just say stop extractivism, because is it actually possible for us to do that?
The issue is overproduction, really.
Exactly.
You know, you have an industry like any other industry under neoliberal capitalism, which is designed to promote the incentive to create profit at all costs. So obviously then the incentive is to produce as much at all costs. So, regardless of who needs it, or, how much of that resource is currently, needed to do other things. No, it's just constant. You've got to produce more. And so, obviously they have targets they got to reach, and their targets keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's not the only aim for that is profit. That's the only ends to that constantly accelerating mechanism. So yeah, I mean, it's not that we're against stopping the extraction of minerals wherever for a need, for an actual need. It's just that we're against this overproduction that extractivism leads to under capitalism.
And we see this typically in Australia. I mean, look, when I was involved in or when I was living in Western Australia, but obviously we see with iron ore, but also with other minerals we seek out of the ground, from lithium right through to nickel, gold, etc. You name it. And that's what it's basically there for. And it's just extracting it all out of there, with very little left for the population as well. There might be a royalty that goes to the state, but it's such an outdated royalty. It's based off not the actual price of per tonne or whatever. It's just based out of a particular how much it's worth when it comes out of the ground, but not when it leaves port, or not when it's sold to itself. Like if Rio Tinto sells it to itself on the Singapore Stock Exchange onto a world level, and use all those taxes, obviously offshore them to colourful countries like the Cayman Islands. They can sell for a higher bidder. I mean, and basically we don't see anything. It's just left with a hole in the ground. And this is basically what we're seeing. All basically the powers that be out in the world, all the multinationals, see Australia as one is to be a land to be exploited to the max. And and there's just nothing responsible about it at all. Someone said that to me once. Says, "Oh, you're against mining." No, I'm not. Not on mining. I think some of them need to be phased. I'm not really a big favour of uranium mining. I'm not a big favour of coal either. That's got to be phased out. But there are other minerals I'm quite still supportive of. We do need iron ore. We do need lithium. We do need these other things. But can we do it in a sustainable way? Sure. Because under capitalism, when we've seen mines closed down, there's still an ore body there and everything else, but they can't make as much profit out of it as much as they like. So what do? Just leave it there and leave all the damage they've done to the surrounding land. So you've got a wasteland and everything else. Hopefully, and all we do is hopefully wait till someone comes along, buys it, and kickstarts it and starts it off again.
Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, so that just leaves one more paragraph, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So environmental pollution. The South American countries are not great polluters. We are marginal polluters. But according to the philosophy of neocolonial environmentalism, our countries are, in reality, highly industrialized countries worldwide owe us an eternal environmental care, because while North America, Europe, and Asian countries generate industries and pollution, we oxygenate the planet. Paradoxically, the industrial product of the great powers is sold to the third world, while the oxygen produced by the third world is not sold to the powers in question. So I think that's an interesting analysis also of, how once again things can be turned on its head. So the third world is accused of creating all of the pollution in the world, but in fact it is the industrialized countries that are creating more and more pollution and use more waste than any, create more waste than any other countries, in the world. I think, and in terms of even worse than that is the military and what the pollution and so on that they create. And of course, we know that the United States, it has the biggest, the greatest military spending in the world. And yet they accuse the third world countries of creating pollution and so on.
Yeah, and it's a bit of it's actually quite sad because countries, there are a lot of countries in Latin America, South America, where a lot of these big corporations, mega, multinational corporations go to extract resources. And these are very critical ecosystems that contribute to a large percentage of the oxygenation of the planet. The most dense wildlife and biospheres, unique biospheres are down there as well. So yeah, it's a sad story, because once they're gone, they're gone. Some of these things don't exist anywhere else.
Yeah, that's right. And then here in Australia, we've got so much rare fauna and flora. It's vital that we actually preserve it and try and increase that again. How much our natural ecosystem is under threat is huge. Some people just don't realise, but how bad it is. It could be complete ecosystem collapse if that happens. And once that happens, and it'll start dying off other ecosystems as well, killing off that. Look, I think we're about to call it a night, but someone from Lex Immers, from the Netherlands. And as greeting comrades, you probably already addressed this, but I'm wondering here in the Netherlands, what do regular Australians, working class Labor, think of the AUKUS thing? Any protests? Not at the moment, Lex. Unfortunately, we've actually both here in Victoria and New South Wales, we've been under lockdowns for many times for quite a long time now. There have been rallies, but it's been mainly over anti-lockdown rallies and about the COVID jab and many other things. But unfortunately, it's been a hot issue. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot of people have been talking about it. And certainly, even within the union, it covers a lot of members that work in the defence industries, building submarines and all that. It certainly has been a hot issue. But has there been any major protests? Well, no, not yet. I think we want to try to get the other end of this first, but I think there's going to be I think some people are dreaming of some big super duper rallies, because a lot of shit things are happening at the us here in Australia. And I think it's, once we can get the working class organised, I think, I can't wait to see that happen, so we can put some proper demands. But obviously, look, this thing it's certainly a very serious issue, and us three here and many others we know are taking it extremely seriously at the moment.
I think most people, when you're talking about the regular sort of, regular Joe on the street, from what I've been hearing and people talk about it, it's more like they're split on two sort of lines. On one sort of side of things, there's a lot of people who take in the anti-China propaganda that has been drummed into them by the media, saying things like, "Oh, well, this is a good idea. We need to counter China. It's a growing influence. Blah blah blah." On the other side of things, well, not really the other side, but I'll tell you what they say, is that they're more of, the Social Democrats, more like side of things. Our Labor Party, for example, people who vote for them would say something like, "Oh, well, no, we shouldn't have abandoned our agreements to the French. The diesel subs were good enough, and if we have to counter China, we agree that China's a national, an existential threat, and we agree with all the anti-China propaganda, but we would rather place sanctions on them instead, or we'd rather deprive them of medicines, of food, all that kind of stuff as well." So unfortunately, there's the one thing they both agree on is that China bad, pretty much, but they just disagree on the ways on which we should be attacking China. So unfortunately, that's something that we need to put a lot of work into countering here in Australia, and probably elsewhere in the world, I suppose, to get that message out there, to say, "No, look, your views aren't that different from each other. You both agree with imperialism. You both agree with fomenting consent for war, and you just disagree with the methods of doing it." So that's where I'm seeing most of the regular working class fall in Australia at the moment.
Yeah, and I've got to say, COVID and these restrictions and the fact that, the vaccines are being made mandatory are superseding really a lot of discussion about anything else amongst the working class at this point in time. It's been extremely divisive. But having said that, I think Richard Wolff described it as, he described the what is it called?
AUKUS.
He described AUKUS as being an elephant organising a very important meeting with beetles, and that was brilliant. It was brilliant. But the real danger lies in the fact that Australia is being primed for a launching pad for a war with China, and that places us in a really dangerous situation. And we would be, I'm pretty sure that this would be the launching pad for war with China. We're the closest to China. America would stay way over there in its own little zone over there, and would be pushing buttons and ringing our prime minister and telling him or her what needs to be done. And it's a real danger for the Australian working class. And part of the fear with these mandatory vaccinations are, what else can they make mandatory? At the moment, they used rubber bullets. Now, apparently they've been used here in Melbourne before at an IMARC demonstration, but we have never seen the likes of those rubber bullets being used on demonstrators before. And yet, again, no protest. No. Is anybody concerned? I don't know. I'm like pulling my hair out thinking.
The media definitely didn't cover it.
What the hell is going on? Nobody's concerned. So we're seeing more and more use of violent force against protesters. We're seeing our military being geared up for war, new warships, nuclear warships, and we're seeing mandatory vaccines being imposed upon us. So does that mean that they'll continue to push forward, and will we see conscription again at some stage? I don't know, but it's all part of that militarization of Australia, and we should be very concerned.
Yeah, there's a dialectical thing happening here. We've got a military-industrial complex that's ever increasing, but we've also got a low-wage police state / prison industrial complex as well, and that's what we were seeing Australia heading down that dark road. But if you want to talk about the two major parties, Lex, the difference between the Labor and Liberal parties is they're the two cheeks of the same arse. That's it. One's the left cheek, the other one's the right cheek of the same arsehole. So, I mean, that's basically what it comes down to, because there's very little difference otherwise besides the shit that comes out of it. So, so I hope that sort of trying to answer you there. Look, and thanks for your support too, Lex. We appreciate that, and you keep up the great work over there too. Look, I think we pretty much finish up now. It's just past 8:30 our time, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. I know, look, just trying to realise why we've got fewer viewers tonight, because there's been people around overseas because of daylight savings, both here in Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales and South Australia. We obviously have daylight savings, the rest of the states and territories don't, or ACT has daylight savings. But, so hence why we're an hour ahead now, so there's a 15-hour time difference between the east coast of Australia and, say, New York, the east coast of the US. So at the moment, I'm not so sure there's a time change over there, and obviously I'm not too sure with Europe and UK, etc. But anyway, look at the world clock, you'll work out that time. But look, once again, thank you very much again, comrades. And look, for those that were watching tonight, look, thank you again. Please share this far and wide. And look, if you want to actually be involved in these discussions live, look, just shoot us a message. I know there's quite a few that do watch that do know me. Feel free to shoot me a message, and I'll try and include you in the future. So we'll round it off tonight. And massive big thank you. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. And in the hands in the air, we'll all say, workers of all countries unite.
Workers of all countries unite.
Unite.
Thank you.
See you later.
See ya.